Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. In this mini-series, over the summer of 2026, we're looking at the future of the US military in terms of C2. Not JADC2 or CJADC2 or even Joint Command, but rather a look in depth at each of the US military services and their aspirations. This is important and timely. Right? Big changes are coming for each service and they differ from each other and the ways that they've historically organised their C2. In this episode, we're talking about the US Navy with Captain Retired David Gast, recently retired from his post as Director for Innovation for the Programme Executive Office C4I. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
At Systematic Incorporated, we provide innovative commercial C2 software solutions. Our SID-aware suite of products accelerates decision-making in contested environments and enables data sharing with partners and allies. Our open platform uses public APIs to connect sensors, shooters, autonomous systems, and mission applications without the need to replace existing hardware.
The US Navy is witnessing a seismic shift in command and control. While units are deployed with a drumbeat not seen since World War II, C2 is shifting away from being carrier strike group centric to one that focuses on command from the Maritime Operations Centre. Given that the US Navy has focused on running C2 from CSGs for nearly 75 years, this is a huge change in the philosophy for people with equally important transitions for platforms and systems too. And while all this is happening, there's an acceleration in the use of autonomous and uncrewed systems, another layer of complication to a significant change programme already underway. There's a lot to cover, and before we get into the details of some of all this, I want to introduce my guest today. Captain Retired David Gast was commissioned as a surface warfare officer in 1996, serving in cruisers and destroyers before a lateral shift into the engineering community. David's subsequent service saw him deeply involved in C2, C4I, integration and interoperability programs at the NRO, NAVWAR, or SPAWAR as it was then, and DCGS-N. He was the Combat Systems Officer in USS NIMITZ for her 2016-2017 workup and deployment before becoming the Deputy Programme Manager for the US Navy's C2 Programme Office, known as PMW 150. He subsequently became the Programme Manager there. David's final tour in the USN was as Director of Innovation for the Programme Executive Office for C4I and the Military Lead for C4IFX. Recently retired, David is now founder and principal of DWG Agile Innovations LLC, an advisory, consulting and coaching firm. Given his history, there are few people better qualified to talk about USN C2. And the views David expresses today are, of course, his own. David, listen, welcome to the show. Congratulations on your retirement. Thanks for your service. You're probably one of the few sailors that is intimately involved in the US Navy's C2 evolution for the past 20 years, right?
Yeah.
And I should say, right, as our audience are a mixed bunch of sailors, Marines, aviators, academics and politicians, as well as sailors, we need to start with everyone on the same page. So can you start by explaining the Navy's approach to C2 as I've known it for like 75 years, this idea of fleet command?
Sure. Again, first off, thank you so much for inviting me on this. I have enjoyed listening to a good number of these over the past 6 months or so, getting caught up in your body of work. So really excited to be here to talk to you. So yeah, I mean, historically, the way the Navy has fought since World War II, the US Navy at least, has been focused on what we now call carrier strike groups. They've gone through a number of name changes over the years, but aircraft carrier strike groups is the current term, where the air wing of the aircraft carrier is the long-range strike arm of the formation, and most of the other ships are there to protect the aircraft carrier. Obviously, the other ships in company may have other missions as well. They may have some strike missions or some ballistic missile defense missions or that sort of thing. But it really is focused on that fairly compact unit of force that moves as a group all around the world, wherever it's going. As we contemplate in the hopes of avoiding a high-end conflict against a peer competitor, let's be honest, particularly if we had to do that in their backyard where they have the interior lines of communication and the home field advantage, as we refer to it, that model has to change. We cannot just operate that way because anytime you're deeply inside the weapons engagement zone of that adversary, they can target you for pretty much anything you do. Any stray communication, any just random, you're seen by a fisherman, they now know where you are and they can lob something very destructive in your direction. So in recognition of that fact, the Navy has begun to focus on this concept of fight from the MOC, the Maritime Operations Center. And that's not really a change driven by ideals of, we should have the Maritime Operations Center just be in charge of everything. It's driven by the reality that the Maritime Operations Center, particularly in that environment where something very far forward is not necessarily going to have all of the data feeds that they're used to operating with at the time, and certainly won't be able to transmit the amount of data that they're currently used to doing. That reality drives the fact that we need to have a central node where all of that data is consolidated, understood, interpreted, and then decision made. It also has to do with the fact of just the sheer size of the Pacific Ocean. And, the U.S. Navy's focus on the Pacific, driven by the last several administrations, we won't be able to do that compact unit of force of the Carrier Strike Group or the Amphibious Readiness Group, all within visual line of sight or maybe slightly over the horizon, but generally within line of sight, sort of moving around as a unit. They have to be spread out, and there has to be a fair amount of the opposition doesn't really know where we're coming from. That's the objective. So that requires we be spread out. That requires we focus on emissions control and a lot of things that we haven't had to do for a very long time. So the ability to coordinate, plan, sequence effects in the area of operation requires, at least at the current state of affairs, given the U.S. and allies and opposition C2 intelligence, surveillance, overhead sensing capabilities, that's going to have to be run at least in the next few years out of the Maritime Operations Center, which, kind of going back to what we're used to doing, is a very big shift.
So I guess there's two questions that come out of that. Does the sort of staff in the MOC replace the high-level CSG C2 team? Because, of course, the carrier will still need its, to run its air operations. It will need its own. The ship has its own command group. The carrier has its own command group. So there's all that stuff that goes on. But the carrier strike element of that, does that get replaced by the MOC as sort of scale and size? Is it tailorable? Is it land or sea based? Or are these things just supposed to be infinitely flexible?
So there's both a theoretical and a practical answer to that question. So strictly speaking, no. The Carrier Strike Group will continue to have a similar kind of staff with a similar set of skill sets and a similar set of tools what they have today. And actually, one of the reasons that in my last answer I kind of talked about for the next few years is and this is very much my personal opinion, but I think there will come a point where we'll get back to the more distributed way that we prefer to operate. I just think that right now it's the confluence of where technology is, where the relative strengths and weaknesses of red and blue are, that is driving us to this. My personal opinion is, we're not going to be doing this for the next 50 years. It's going to be a maybe 5 to 10, maybe 15 year kind of window where it's like this. And then technology will have caught up in a lot of ways and operational concepts will have been further refined to where we're getting back to a more distributed, intent-based command, the way we sort of historically like to operate. But that was a bit of a diversion. So the functions that are in the strike group will remain in the strike group, and the strike group will still be a thing. We will still have strike groups. And again, there will still be a strike group commander and an air wing commander and all that sort of stuff. However, those strike groups will be spread out over much larger areas. And I suspect will be much more dynamic in terms of construct. We do a little of this today, or I will say as recently as 2017, when I was on my last deployment with the NIMITZ, we did have ships that did not leave with us on deployment that joined us there, or we joined in the Gulf for operations. ships that spun off partway through deployment to go do something in the Gulf of Oman or that sort of thing. So even now, you don't leave and come back and operate the entire time with the same set of, say, 5 ships. I suspect that will get even more dynamic in the future, where more ships will join or leave or switch or change tasking in midstream. But there will still be that function. The strike group commander and his staff, the air wing commander, that is sort of geographically tailored, though there's discussions about distributing that as well. We'll still have that role. The difference will be the high-level coordination will put a lot more responsibility on the Maritime Operations Center, rather than just, hey, carrier strike group, here's your tasking, here's your box, go operate in the box and do these things. And you manage your own self-defense, manage your own strike schedule. We'll tell you what we want you to hit, but you figure out the details of it. The goal is not to have the 3,000-mile screwdriver, but we'll have to be a lot more directive nature to it. And some of that is driven by counter C5ISR&T, command control communications computers, combat systems, and intelligence, countering the enemy's capabilities in those areas to avoid being targeted and sunk, will require a lot more sort of directivity in terms of tasking, location, routes traveled, when you can launch things and not, when you need to be in position to launch a thing and when you need to run away, that sort of thing. So a lot more burden will fall on the Maritime Operations Center for that.
So it's interesting. So I get the idea of a mock of distributing C2 because the carrier, the centerpiece of any carrier strike group, is a target in itself. If you know the C2 is on there, right, it's like double the target. It's really important, particularly in counter C2 warfare. Everyone goes after headquarters on the land. At sea, you can see it, happening just as well. It's also within the philosophy of multi-domain operations, right, is to try and disperse risk, responsibilities, but also to synchronize and apportion. You've got to do that at a high level. If you're going to have 2 or 3 CSGs in theater at any one time, whether they're just US or allied as well, sometimes someone's got to do this stuff of synchronizing the activities and the impacts, the effects that it's trying to bring to bear all at the same time. So I get all of that, but it's complex, right? Because you're almost just creating another layer of command between the COCOM and the CSG. You're slotting something else in there as well, right?
Well, I mean, that layer does already exist. So, for example, in the Pacific Theater, which is where we're going to end up, I think, talking a lot because that's where our attention is, though obviously with the things currently going on as of now, end of May, obviously a lot going on in the Persian Gulf too, but sort of the long-term focus is on the Pacific. So the COCOM Indo-Pacific is there today. Pacific Fleet is there today. 3rd Fleet and 7th Fleet are under PAC Fleet today. And, the equivalent structures for all the other services, Air Force, Army, Marine Corps, have their equivalents to that setup. So in that sense, we're not adding a layer of command that wasn't there before. However, how those layers of command will operate and the role they play will change and is changing already today.
And I guess the mock is not just about the CSGs, right? But it's about synchronizing the other components as well to achieve whatever the Joint Commander is after, whatever the COCOM is after. The mock is almost not just a maritime operations center. It's got to have a huge degree of jointry within it, right? That sometimes isn't present within a CSG.
Yes, absolutely. And to your point, and it actually kind of goes back to the part of your previous question that I didn't actually get to, of the sort of land or sea or infinitely flexible question, is exactly that. And that is the structure that is being played with right now, details of which we can't go into, but that fact that it is going to be a joint operations center. And at certain phases, the Air Force may have the lead, or the Marine Corps may have the lead, or the Navy may have the lead. And that may change literally day to day, who has the primary effort, who has a secondary effort, et cetera. And the goal is to be that infinitely flexible because, again, everybody in the world knows everybody that cares knows where PAC Fleet headquarters is, Indo-PACOM headquarters is, 3rd Fleet and 7th Fleet, whether they're afloat or ashore. Those are all known. They're mostly protected by political considerations rather than military considerations. And should someone decide to cross that line, you have to be prepared for that. So the goal is really to be able to devolve, be able to move, be able to, if you need to move command afloat, you maybe have a carrier that's not in the WES, they could become Pac Fleet Commander for some period of time. Practically speaking, we're still sort of working on how that's going to work. We've made a lot of progress. We've implemented a lot of change already, but that will continue to go on and develop. And it is really an agile approach of, in the commercial world, it would be build a little, test a little, or fail fast. It's kind of that same idea of, okay, this operation, we're going to try this, or this exercise, we're going to try doing it this way. Oh, this worked great. That didn't work so great. And we'll iterate. So that's kind of how it's working going forward.
So not only is this going on, but the command system that sits behind this sort of change in philosophy is also changing, right? The US Navy has run with something called Geeks. I know affectionately, having worked alongside a variety of US platforms, Geeks was a sort of standard thing that you saw in every ship. And Geeks is about to go through a fundamental change as well, right? Pretty much at the same time. Is that partly because it can't handle... I would say, it's always been able to handle the distributed nature of naval warfare, but the scale, the intensity, the number of feeds that it's now going to deal with, is it just time for a reset?
So I was the program manager for GCCS-M, Geeks-M, for the US Navy and those foreign partners that purchase it. That was my responsibility for those 6 years I was in PMW 150. And it is still, as of today, the official Common Operational Picture application for the US Navy. And then there's Geeks-J, the joint version that is actually run in the various operation centers. And there are functions of that system that, in my opinion, need to persist. However, what the long range, over the horizon maritime operation or joint operations center centric nature of a future high-end fight is not what Geeks was designed for. Because Geeks was designed for situational awareness and sort of common understanding of where we are. It was not designed to give you targeting quality information at all times of everything everywhere. That's not what it's for. It's not designed to do that. And to a certain extent, it can't do that. It can actually do more of that than people think. That's actually one of the things I had to deal with. But again, to the sort of stated targeting quality, I know where everything is all the time. Yeah, it can't do that. So other tools are required. The Navy is actually still working through exactly what the mix of those things are going to be. There are people that think Palantir is the bee's knees and it's going to solve everything. And we just put everything in Palantir and all the problems are solved. And don't get me wrong, I had Palantir on contract as a program manager. I really, really like the things that they are good at. They are better at than anybody else in the world. There is some misunderstanding of exactly what it is they're good at. And the things that a lot of, again, personal opinion here, a lot of the 3 and 4 stars look at Palantir and they're like, oh, that's beautiful. And it has all the information I want. And it's all in the same place. And I love the way you interact it. And look, you can just click on the thing and get all this information. And that's all cool. There's actually like 100 companies in the world could do that. What's really special about Palantir is actually their data layer and the way they think about and approach and treat data on the back end. And that could be a whole hour-long conversation to itself. I won't go further down that path, but there are people that are like, oh, just do everything in Palantir. Could Palantir do it? Sure. They're really smart people. They got a lot of really smart data engineers. They could figure it out, throw the problem out, give them long enough and enough money, they can solve it. But they've got a really long list of things to do. And there's a lot of windows of opportunity in there for other companies, other organizations, and other solutions than that. So to that point, some of the things that Geeks-M does, Palantir doesn't do yet. In fact, it actually pulls it from Geeks-M today to do it. And again, there are other alternatives being explored and all that. But again, back to your sort of original question, Geeks-M wasn't designed to do what we're asking a targeting common operational picture / common intelligence picture solution to do. It can't do all of that. It at least needs to be supplemented. I do actually think there are commercial solutions out there that could replace a lot of those functions as well. And touching briefly back into the Palantir discussion, we need more than one data provider. We don't want to be in a situation where like everything is with those guys and we're as locked in with them as we have been with other big contractors before. So again, not anti-Palantir. I love what they do. They're just not the answer to every question.
So if we sort of get that, the other question I have around this system, and you sort of intimated there that there's no decision, we're still waiting, we're still assessing. But the problem, one of the problems must be with the deployment ratios that we've got now across the US Navy fleet and for the US Coast Guard, I'm guessing as well, is that you can't do a big bang of a changeover, provide everyone the kit, and on the 1st of June, we're all going to change this new system because some people are out there deployed, they're midway through deployment. You can't get in a submarine which is deployed midway through a 6-month deployment. How do you change something of this magnitude for the US Navy, which is a complex global organization, which is doing its business, the heart beating of operations every day? It's got to be a phased transition, right?
It does for, purely practical purposes. However, that is becoming less and less true as time goes on. So just between my time on the Nimitz and today, within the US Navy, the networking infrastructure that we put on ships and the wide area networking infrastructure between ships has substantially modernized. It's got a long way to go, but it has come a long way. I used to say this in response to some of the work that Project Overmatch was doing. And I was part of that, working very closely with that team. And they're still doing what they're doing. Is we're an order of magnitude better than we were a couple of years ago, but we're an order of magnitude or two away from where we need to be. So we went from, just saying purely software sides, I want to put a new version of GCCS-M or Maritime Tactical Command and Control System, MTC2 or whatever, on a ship. In the case of MTC2, that we can and do update over the air every 4 to 6 weeks, last time I checked. That can be new features, that can be new functions, that can be fixes. And you can, and we have literally remove a module of capability and put a new one in place with a software change sent via satellite to a ship. So now, are we there with all the software, and is the hardware and the compute stack on the ship, on every ship in the Navy, in the place it needs to be to do that everywhere simultaneously? No. But we're moving very quickly in that direction. And part of that is the embrace of commercial technology. I mean, the challenges of intermittent connectivity that a ship in a weapons engagement zone has is very different than almost anything else in the world. So that particular aspect is unique, but we're not the only people, and the military aren't even the only people that need to be able to keep operating a data-centric operation while not connected to the cloud or to the internet or to whatever. So there are commercial solutions out there. And again, quite honestly, the actual hardware that both the C4I systems and the combat systems of the US Navy run on are mostly commercial solutions already. So basically adopting a lot of the data center modularity, where you don't have to rip out an entire 10 to 30 racks, depending on the ship or whatever, of computers and replace them with entirely new racks filled with entirely new stuff. We've already moved past that over the past several years. Now, it's not as modular, it's not as easy, it's not as quick as I would like it to be, or I'm sure Admiral Okano or the CNO would like it to be. But it is much more modular and much more able to do those upgrades very rapidly already today than it was 5 or 6 years ago. So it does have to be implemented in phases, But the modularity that we are incorporating will let us do that much more quickly. And when we determine the path we want to go down, we'll be able to focus on going down that path. And when we determine we need to pivot, we'll be able to pivot much more quickly.
Okay. I want to talk, because you raised about pulling out racks and putting them back in and stuff. This is the situation some partners and allies are in. I want to talk about that in a second. But can we just go back? You mentioned Project Overmatch, right? Can you just explain to the audience just a little bit about Overmatch, what it was, what it is, what it was trying to do?
So that gets classified quickly. It's one of those, like Fight Club, the first rule of Overmatch is we don't talk about Overmatch. But it was basically the Navy's contribution to CJAD-C2. So it was that as the entire Department of Defense, Department of War have tried to update their C4I, Command, Control, Communications, Computers, and Intelligence, Overmatch was sort of that single lead point for the Navy of that transformation. It was intended to do some experimentation, some development, some coordination across the various organizations within the U.S. Navy, the different PEOs and program offices and all of that, and seeking to consolidate all of that, focus efforts on, we really, really, really need to solve this particular problem, so we're going to go after this piece of the problem. That was writ large what it was intended to do, and it had a lot of success in doing so. It is in the process of being folded into a new organization, which I think we'll probably get to. But again, that's kind of what it was for.
Cool. Okay. So just moving on now, I want to go back to, I raised it about partners and allies. One of the key things that the US Navy has always been pretty good about is the ability to link up with pretty much anyone, right? I remember the first time you got in with a US Navy ship before we even had Link 11 working. We had Navy Red. Someone would come over with a fill gun. You top up your crypto every 24 hours and suddenly you could speak to an American voice on the other side and you were connected. And then Link 11 started to work, and then satellite Link 11, and then the connectivity just sort of blossomed from there. That was lovely for the Royal Navy. Other nations didn't have that same facility. The USN, the US as a whole, provided sort of standalone systems which they could take over, plug in. And various navies around the world have invested quite a lot of time and resource making sure they're interoperable with the US. Is this going to be a big change for them as well? What will they need to do in order to work with the new systems?
So, as with all things, there's good news and bad news on that front. So, I'll start with the bad news. The bad news is things are changing very quickly. The US Navy is moving away from a lot of things we've done for a long time, legacy software, legacy hardware, that sort of stuff. So, that will drive friction where we have to, in order to remain connected with our partners on whom we will rely for a lot of things as we do today, we will have to either maintain backwards compatibility or help them catch up. And sometimes that's not going to be a clear, obvious answer which way to go on that, whether it's, to your point, flying a box over or handing it over pier side or just providing an update or whatever. The good news, though, is it is going to be a lot more commercial based. It is going to be a lot more common standards sort of thing. So one of the issues we had with actually the latest version of GCCS-M 415, not that you care about the version, but that was the latest version as of a couple of years ago. I believe it still is it was a complete re-architecture, and it ran on a different hardware and software stack than all the previous versions did. But it was all commercial-based stuff. And that's where a lot of the changes in this administration's focus and on acquisition have gone in moving more commercial directions is, that version of GCCS-M was running on a commercial server, running commercial software, running a commercial operating system, and it was a mix of containers and virtual machines that ran on top of that for GCCS-M. But because just the mindset everyone has, they treat all of those things as, well, it's a weapon system. And from one perspective, that's really good that they treat it that way. But in another perspective, it's really bad. They treat it as if this particular model of server with this particular version of software all stacked up and up and up, that is the same as a missile or a missile launcher. Therefore, when you change it, and this goes back to you got to rip out all the racks and replace them all, you can't just install the next version of that server. That's an entirely new thing. And that's not really true. So a lot of the changes are just recognizing that reality, that that's not really true. Yes, you've got to do your due diligence that next version of the server doesn't do something weird and break your system. But you can actually figure that out pretty quickly these days. So to that point, the direction we're heading is as long as your server meets these criteria, the rest of the stack will be fine. As long as you're on at least this version of Microsoft or Google or Red Hat or wherever the Navy ends up going. I have opinions on that, but that detail doesn't really matter in this case. It'll be fine. So I do believe we'll be able to go forward, and you will have the option of, hey, you want to buy a US Navy rack? It's the same one we use for our C4I or combat system or both, which is also the direction we're going. Or honestly, you can just buy anything that meets these requirements, load this software on, and it'll be okay. I do think we will reach a state where that will be true. And one of the things we were working on with that version of GCCS-M, because we were updating it so quickly, we were updating it on the order of once a month. That's not the tempo with which the partners that bought GCCS-M were used to getting releases. So we were in conversations, at least at the time, of do we want to move like the commercial world into more of a licensing model than a purchase model? And whether we do or not, how do we just make sure everybody gets all the updates? Because you can get wildly divergent enough pretty quickly if you're updating at that rate. So, like I said, good news, bad news.
And talking about timeframes, I mean, when do allies and partners need to start thinking about this stuff? I mean, I'm sure most already are. They're already aware. They're waiting for an announcement from PLW 150 or wherever to go, this is it, go for it. Is there a time frame they can look at for that? Even in terms of years, are we a year away? Are we 3 years away? Are we on the cusp right now?
So I think we're on the cusp. There are things moving very quickly. I've alluded a couple times to the big reorg in DOW acquisition with the move from program executive offices to portfolio acquisition executives, the realignment of acquisition authority. What that's intended to go after is exactly this. It's supposed to help us iterate more quickly, to make decisions, commit to those decisions, execute those decisions. And it's really, honestly, it's about tightening the OODA loop of acquisition is what it's intended to do. So, if you want to think about it in those terms, and to narrow the diversity of projects operating in stovepipes. And again, my opinion, we don't want to get to where there's one answer for everything because that's bad too. You get to your single points of failure, but there's not 5 independent answers. There's 2 or 3 coordinated answers that add resilience without wasting lots of money and resources and time on low priority things. So to your question about time frame, they certainly need to be thinking about it now, and fingers crossed if all goes right, and hope isn't a strategy, but the direction that the Navy is pushing, I believe some of those things will be clarified within the next year or so. We'll have a pretty clear answer of this is the kind of hardware you're going to need. This is the amount and capacity of it you're going to need. And these are the standards it'll have to meet. And in some cases, the stuff that you bought from us or on your own will meet those requirements and you don't need to upgrade anything. In other cases, it's like, yeah, you're going to need twice as many virtual processors, but you can buy that for $1,000 a ship or $10,000 a ship on your own if you want, and just stick it in the racks you've already got.
And that will matter, particularly because the focus of the USN is the Pacific, right? Absolutely, 100%. 30 years ago, the focus was with NATO, a single organization that, provided they had the standardization, they would push it out to partner nations. You're now dealing with bilateral relationships with each of these partners, right? With Vietnam, with the Philippines, with Indonesia, with South Korea. It's a big difference in terms of these generational changes, right? The Pacific not only is a different operating environment with adversaries and the sea and bathymetry and meteorology and flying conditions, all that stuff, but it's also the sheer number of partners out there, which are all bilateral, right?
Yes. So it's the mix and match of what information can be shared with whom. And actually, all of the challenges we're describing, including this one, by and large, aren't technology problems. Technology exists to solve almost all of the problems. There's some outliers, again, details of which get classified very quickly for obvious reasons. But kind of going back to the CJAD-C2, most of the things that CJAD-C2 wants to do are very doable. Again, there are commercial solutions to most of the pieces to that. Much more of it is cultural and policy, kind of going back to that we treat it as a weapon system, whether it is or not question, and just what's ingrained in everyone in terms of what timeframes are and things like that. So the historical answer to the multilateral or multiple unilateral, if you will, or bilateral agreements has been, well, I've got a channel to talk to Korea, and that's this system. And then I got a different one to talk to Japan, and that's this system. And then a different one to talk to NATO, whatever. And, oh, by the way, I'm only set up to talk to two of those at a time. So which two are the most important for me to talk to? Going forward, the technology exists to sort of label and tag and say, these are the things these guys can see, these are the things those guys can see, and it's automatically routed. And only if a weird exception comes up of like, ooh, it's not authorized for them, but they really, really need to know it, I'm going to have a human step in and say, yes, that's allowed to go to them now, sort of thing. It's not trivial, but it's not that hard technologically. It's going to be much more about the process, the mindset, the how we think about the solution space than anything else. So again, the move to more commercial, the move to more rapid iterations, while it will create its own friction and its own challenges, will actually help a lot of those problems also.
And I guess because we talked about main suppliers, was it going to be one or was it going to be defined? Industry is obviously very excited about this changeover as well. You've got big pushes from the big companies. But, you've intimated that the USN is not going to be locked into a contract with a single prime supplier for this system for the next 25 years, right? That's not the way this is going to be constructed. It's going to be smarter and more agile and less time defined. And I mean, that's eminently sensible. It's a bit more complicated in terms of acquisition though, right?
Absolutely. It absolutely is. Yeah, which is why we have to sort of change a lot of the processes. And along with all of the changes in how the U.S. Navy is organizing its acquisition authorities and organization, there are in that same law changes that are supposed to accelerate the ITAR problems and the foreign military sales and even direct commercial sales. Because to that point, if we say, well, what you really need is this many CPUs of this quality or higher, this amount of memory of this speed or faster and this much capacity. And, you're going to do some AI stuff. You need some GPUs or TPUs or those processors over there. Some of those things are ITAR controlled, but a lot of them are like, you just go buy them from Dell or Hewlett Packard or NVIDIA or Google or whoever, Thales or, pick your vendor. So direct commercial sales for pieces of it will actually make more sense than a foreign military sales with all of the bureaucracy involved in that and all the approvals and timelines and all that sort of stuff. So that is actually a clause in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2026 is to try and streamline some of that process as well.
Okay. Now, listen, we covered the big questions, but the one that I keep getting asked by people to ask my guests is, what's this going to feel like for a sailor in 3, 4, 5 years? Is it going to be markedly different from their experience now? Is it just, crack on with your day job because it's just the systems behind that are changing? Or is this a fundamental reset and rethink?
I think it will be obviously in between those two extremes. I suspect it will end up being closer to the latter. So closer to the user interface is mostly the same, or if anything, it gets simplified over what you had before. It still looks pretty much the same, all the things you did before work, but there's faster, quicker, easier ways, and parts of your job are automated now. That is the direction we intend to go. And I think there's a good chance we will do it successfully. There's an old saying, all models are wrong, some are useful. As we are moving forward, that's the plan. That's where we're trying to go. We're trying to put as little burden. In fact, we're trying to remove as much burden from the sailor on the ship or the Marine on the island or on the ship, as much friction from their work to let them focus on the important parts of their job. So I don't think hey, we're going to change the user interface for the common operational picture so much that you're going to have to go to school for a month to just figure out how it works. It's going to be, again, it still looks and feels the same. It just has these new features. And oh, by the way, that reset you had to do every 12 hours, you don't have to do that anymore. And a lot of the pruning of the track history, that'll be automated for you. And only really challenging decisions of, are these two tracks the same track or not? That will, at least in the short term, go to an operator to decide that. But they won't have to make that decision for every time you want to merge or, split out. Oh, wow, we thought that was one, but that's actually two. They won't have to do that as manually as often. So that's, again, I know I'm wrong about some part of that, but I don't know which part. But that is the direction we're going. That is the goal. And again, a bit of a side conversation, but one of the things I was pushing for in my time in the Navy and will continue to push for on my time out of the Navy is a deeper understanding of that sort of human system integration, making it so that the things that need to be obvious are obvious, the things that need to be doable are doable, and the things that need to be easy are easy, and making sure we understand which is which. So the things that can be automated with low risk, I think, will be quickly. And, there'll be some learning there. We'll automate something we shouldn't and then say, oh, we shouldn't have done that. Or we'll hold off on automating something that would have solved a lot of problems for too long. But we will learn and we will move forward. And I do think in the future, there will be a lot more focus on how do we do the mission rather than how do I learn to interact with this tool.
David, thanks so much for your time. I'm left with a very optimistic feeling about what the next generation of Naval C2 looks and feels like, particularly for the experience of the sailor. And I think your honesty in expressing the fact that the solution is never going to be fixed. It's going to be an evolution, a spiral upgrade, a different set of experiences, but one that should feel better for sailors and for officers in the mock and all the rest of that stuff, I think is genuinely, I feel very optimistic on behalf of it. So thanks very much again for your time. Please enjoy your retirement. And again, thanks for your service, sir.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure.
The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic is trusted by more than 50 nations worldwide, including 18 NATO members. SitAware is an industry-leading command and control software suite that is cloud-enabled, edge-capable, and coalition-ready.
We hope you enjoy the show, as well as telling your friends and colleagues about it. Please do hit the like or subscribe buttons. This episode is produced by AureliusThinking.com as a show for the Waiver Room, a home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.